Hey everybody, welcome to our session. We're going to give everyone a few seconds to join, but if you are in the right place, you have joined Space Law, AI, and the Weaponization of Space, Navigating a Crowded Neighborhood. So we're happy to have everyone here today. We are going to start off by talking about regulatory frameworks, treaties, and norms that affect space. And this is going to provide a backdrop for our other panelist conversations on the militarization of space, diplomacy, the potential of increased cooperation with China. And our last panelist will be talking about space studies and the role of AI and things that we can do to be mindful of keeping space studies or making it more diverse so that it reflects diverse human capacity and resources. Okay, so we're going to get started with Dr. Mark Kelso, and if you want to display your PowerPoint, and I'll just say a few words about you. Mark is an adjunct faculty member at APUS and a practicing attorney. He had a distinguished career in the Army. He's a retired Chief Warrant Officer 4, and he was a U.S. Army Master Aviator. In addition to his PhD, he earned his LLM at the University of Mississippi School of Air and Space Law. So he will be talking, as you can see, about space law and the policy for next generation of space explorers and giving us an overview of those treaties, accords, and beyond. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Dr. Watts. So again, my name is Mark Kelso, and my presentation is going to be on the space law and policy for the next generation. And we're going to look at kind of a basic overview of what we have now and look into some things to think about what we probably would need for the future of these our new space explorers. So here we are, coming with the next generation of human explorers and going into space. Total off-world explorations are coming. We know that. And we do have the governance in place right now. A lot of it is international law. And we also have our United States law. A lot of this presentation is going to basically focus on what we do in the United States. And that's just what we do. And really, that's all really about is just safe operations, peaceful operations, and to prevent any kind of catastrophic loss of life or in property for that matter. So this is the purpose of the presentation, right? We have space travel. We're looking at moon bases. There's a trip to Mars coming up, and who knows whatever else is. These are all possible or have been done already. So again, main focus here is going to be on the U.S. commercial and private space exploration sector. And it's going to be coming here a little bit later with like, do we really, do we need to revise these things, or are they good as it is? So basically, our current space law policy. And everything generates off the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, right? Now, like 2020, we have the Artemis Accords, and it's all about peaceful exploration of space. Here in the United States, we've enacted various space law acts, launch acts. So throughout the years, and the purpose of these acts were to favor commercial interests in space exploration. They can't rely on NASA all the time, but their due challenges do exist. So what does the Outer Space Treaty do? It provides a framework for international space law for the peaceful use of benefit for all countries. It was comprised of 17 articles. We want to talk about a couple of them today, and again, this is bound in international law, which is obviously the United Nations. And it does cover both the government and non-governmental entities, which is very important to do when we start looking at commercial and also private space exploration. So what I wanted to show is basically, and we're going to talk about a couple of articles in our space treaty, but Article 3 is very important, and that's how it really gets us into the international law aspect of this. And it's really more like a soft law. It's not like a hard governing law, and it's a treaty. So whenever we have the treaties, everybody has to be a signatory to the treaty. And if they're not a signatory to the treaty, they're not bound by the treaty. And just for the liability purposes, I just want to bring up the Liability Convention, which was enacted in 1972, again, based off the Outer Space Treaty. And that's about who is liable for any damage, right? So if anything on the way to space, in space, who's liable for the damage it causes, right? And again, this is based on Article 7 of the Outer Space Treaty. And again, only applies to members of the treaty, right? So if you're not a member of the treaty, what can they really do? So here's just a basic question. What if the launching state is us, is the United States, and the space mission causes damage on US territory? Does the Outer Space Treaty apply? Who is responsible and who would have the jurisdiction, right? So actually, the Outer Space Treaty would not apply. It won't apply to us because we're the launching state. And obviously, who would be responsible would actually be the launching entity. And who has the jurisdiction? Well, launch licenses come from the federal government, mainly the FAA, right? So, or the AST, Commercial Space Transportation Office. So, federal courts would get jurisdiction in this respect. So, Artemis Accords came out in 2020. A lot of signatories to this one, but not everybody's a member of it. And basically, the purpose was to foster the national cooperation to bolster space exploration. That means every kind of space exploration and peaceful operations between everybody. And a lot of this is also based off the Outer Space Treaty. And what I wanted to say was basically, especially for the future space explorers, if something happens, they want to have help, right? So the good thing about what this does, and also we also have the rescue agreements and everything else with the conventions, but rescue of astronauts, and then if you do rescue them, you got to return them. And then if you've lost objects or something in outer space, you want to return them. The important thing to note with this is it's all reasonable efforts. They only need to take what they consider a reasonable effort. There's also the protection of space heritage, which is very important. But again, just like the Outer Space Treaty, it's non-binding. So 1984, we established the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. It's known as AST. And the purpose was to regulate the U.S. commercial space transportation industry with the important goal is to comply with international obligations, right, for the United Nations, for the Outer Space Treaty, and protect the health and safety of our people and everybody else's. And overall, we would want to, keep our foreign policy interests, intact. What do they do? Okay, so the AST, they regulate, right? They issue launch licenses. They certified certain spacecrafts, not all of them. There's qualification and training for the flight crews. And key note here is they just oversee the private sector. And the big word is facilitate and encourage commercial space operations. Want to get the commercial space operations going. And they do recommend any kind of changes to existing policies. Now, as far as the certification of spacecrafts, and I want to say either governmental or non-governmental, okay? So we got like SpaceX or Boeing, right? The Boeing Starliner. Those are certified by the AST, right? But not all aircraft are, or not spacecrafts are. If anything in the suborbital realm, which you'll see like Blue Origin, I'm going to talk about in a second, and Virgin Galactic, we will not certify them. They're not certified, and what the requirement is before anybody wants to get on those, they have to receive informed consent in writing to the spaceflight participant that tells them, hey, this aircraft's not certified by the FAA or AST or any United States entity. And this is what they don't do. And the thing with this is they're prohibited from mission regulation. They can't do nothing, right? By Congress, federal law. And right now that is kind of set to expire this January coming up 2025. And obviously they do not certify space missions, not yet anyway. So how did we get here, right? So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these space launch acts, right, come in place since Reagan years to currently present, right? Department of Transportation runs it through the FAA. It basically wrote regulatory oversight, and it basically, I say, license and regulate. And the big thing is it encourages competition. It's not just NASA anymore. NASA can't do all this. We got SpaceX out there. I know the Boeing Starliners have some issues, but they're working on that. But what about like a lot of these private non-governmental entities? Something that's not, with they actually would have a launch license, but what about the other ones? So I just put this out there. I call it the big three. Today I'm calling it the big three. What do you have to do to launch into space? I'm say it could be suborbital, orbital, or whatever you want to do. And there's a lot of pieces go into this, obviously, but you would need an FAA issued launch license. Okay, you need that. You'd have to have the capability of launching, which would be rockets and personnel, everything else you need. And you need a lot of money, right? It takes a lot of money to launch into space. So if you look at some of the suborbital flight, you got here's Virgin Galactic right here. And we also have Blue Origin, right? So these are private companies that authorize into suborbit, very few little 4 or 5 minutes in actual weightless gravity into space. It'll kind of look like almost like what's behind me. And they're very, very, very expensive. Okay. And that's not really, there's a launch license, but there's no regulations other than, it's the informed consent that they have to do. But what about the other than the suborbital space flight, right? Something that goes outside of suborbit. So in the news, a couple weeks ago, the Polaris Dawn mission, which is incredible, 5 days in orbit, right? Uh, Private spacewalks. I mean, unbelievable. No one ever imagined this, ever imagined this. So this is kind of really cool for what we see here. But I did, and I brought this in here because I did actually read this last week, and it was in the news, and what they were asking was, did they violate the Outer Space Treaty, right? Did they really violate it? So if we go and we look into Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, which talks about launching states with authorizing and continuing supervising the appropriate part of the treaty, right? And we are, and did they really? Well, they got the launch license, so I don't really know. And it would be my opinion that they kind of really didn't violate it as far as they authorized it. I mean, they actually certified the launch, so I don't really think there's a major problem with that. But so what? So what do we do now, right? So, but thinking about what they already had in place, even for some future space explorers. We already had the Outer Space Treaty. We still have that. We have the various conventions and agreements, and then we have the Artemis Accords. And United States, we have our Department of Transportation, FAA, Office of Space Transportation, and that would always apply. So it got me thinking was like we need more oversight and regulation for future space explorers. And what we don't want to, I mean, obviously, in these space acts, we don't want to stifle competition. We want to increase it. But we also want to streamline, and the government wants to streamline it, and they also want to make it more efficient. So if we look at some possible requirements, I'm not saying we need them, but you know, outer space is getting crowded every day. They're launching satellites almost on a weekly basis, And if a lot of these entities, private entities, possess that big three that I said, would there have to be some increased oversight and regulation, other than what we have, right? So other than soft law, which is international treaties and the conventions, but a possible way we do it is to be a little more specific, increased letter of agreement or memorandum of understanding that really kind of would really make things happen a little bit differently, right? So I know, that the office of, we're going to get in a second here with this new Space Act. We want space travel to be safe as possible, right? And we also want to make sure we cover responsibility and accountability. And the last thing here is, do we really want, would we want the FAA to actually certify space missions, and could they actually stop them? And how would that stifle the competition? But last year, 2023, two recent space policies, Commercial Space Act of 2023, which also runs with the FAA's Aerospace Rulemaking Committee, which is going to make recommendations. And I put it on the slide here, which is very important, is Commercial Space Act was fully supported by Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, who are the suborbital launch entities, and SpaceX for that matter. So this is something new that I think they'd be looking at, and it's really about to modernize what we have, to update it. We want to make sure the United States is the world leader in commercial space activities. So they're looking mainly at some type of a certification process. Not a lot out on this yet, but it will comply with all the current obligations that we already have with the Outer Space Treaty and the conventions. It's really about responsible behavior, right? And the one thing they're looking at, which I think is very interesting and probably needed, is how are they going to deal with their space debris mitigation plan? So if they launch things up in here in the satellite and they stop working, what are they going to do about it? Are they going to deorbit it? Are they going to move it? How are they going to deal with it? And of course, and we have this now, that's the learning periods to increase social space flight. And this is the rulemaking committee, just even worth, is it actually financially worth actually making future regulations to the commercial, space flight. Basically, it could make it cost more money to regulate it even higher. And that's report was due out this summer. I have not seen that yet. So here's an example. We'll talk about something Russia and China did. They have an agreement, right? So we're looking at our moon base, and they're looking at a moon base too. So they've come out together with a memorandum of understanding for a comprehensive strategy partnership, right, for their International Lunar Research Station, right, which is a moon base with a nuclear reactor. So you kind of think, like, this agreement, is it really followed with international space law and policy? Article 4, I mean, that's nuclear weapons, mass destruction. But funny thing is, neither China nor Russia are members of the Artemis Accords, but they're both members of the Outer Space Treaty. And lastly, for China, they've never been to the International Space Station. It never could, but they have their own space station, so they wouldn't even need that. So something to think about, we wrap this up, is like, do we really need the revisions, right? Do we need new policies? Is there a better way to certify and control? And what are the challenges if we do try? And the challenge is if we try to change a treaty as international law, it would be very hard, very, very hard to do. So that is basically my presentation here. And I believe we're going to wait on the end for questions. So I turn it back over to Dr. Watts. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was really informative. Next, we have Dr. Larissa Beavers. And Dr. Beavers is a senior space developer, instructor, and assistant clinical professor at the University of Alabama, Huntsville. She also has a distinguished military career, but in the Air Force. She was a first sergeant instructor at a space operator school at Vandenberg Space Force Base and an intelligence analyst. She is a graduate of the Doctorate in Strategic Intelligence from American Public University. So as you can see, she's going to be talking to us about the militarization of space. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Beavers.
Thank you, Dr. Watts. Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending. And so I'm going to be talking about the militarization of space and kind of how this has evolved. I wouldn't really call it new warfare. It's been around for a little bit, but we're definitely seeing an evolution in it. So that's what we're going to be kind of discussing. So the purpose when I started this research was really, since there have been launches, there's always been that question kind of lingering, like what happens if weapons end up being used in space? What does that look like? And that's a really complex and challenging question. So this doesn't necessarily answer that question, but it kind of talks about the challenges and the evolution of this over time. And so what we're looking at here is kind of this link of the militarization of space and the evolution of warfare. And so it's really important to understand that there's a difference between the militarization of space and the weaponization of space. But there is a connection between the two, right? So military is in charge of kind of protecting. A lot of times that involves developing weapon systems. And so we're going to kind of look at how does this impact the weaponization of space? How does this impact international norms and things that are currently being talked about, and kind of goes off of Dr. Kelso's presentation that he just did. So we see that space warfare is emerging as a critical domain in modern warfare. And so we really need to understand this militarization of space and its impact that it has on the weaponization of space in order to kind of mitigate some of the conflicts that are currently happening, and then what that potentially means for the space domain and the space enterprise. So just to kind of start off with the historical context, we see in the very beginning with the Soviet Union and the United States, kind of this launching this national pride aspect. Who can get there first? Of course, the Soviet Union kind of shocked with their launch. And then we kind of see this evolution of the development of satellites. But in the very beginning, the international community as a whole wasn't really concerned about protecting those assets. And what I mean by that is kind of shielding them. Electronic warfare wasn't a huge thing, collecting information off of each other, those type of things. So we see this kind of evolution of, okay, we have satellites, we have imagery satellites, we're no longer dropping film in the ocean, we're able to be able to kind of do that a little more efficiently now. So then we see early military applications kind of coming into play. We have our ground-based systems and then our space-based systems with our electronic warfare, the different radar systems that we use for missile warning and detection, things like that. So then we have these kind of more modern advancements in space technologies as we walk through history. We have ASAT, anti-satellite weapon systems that can be launched from many different platforms. So they can be launched from the air, the ground, the sea. So we kind of see this really big evolution. And even between all this, we have this establishment of military space forces. So Russia had their own kind of similar to the Space Force. We see China focusing on their strategic support force, where they're going to be separating into these different specialized areas because they understand the importance of space and what that means. And we'll kind of get into why is space so important in this current day and age, and what kind of power does that give a nation if they are able to kind of hold that power in their hands, and how is that potentially going to change the way that things are done in a warfare or conflict type scenario. So again, we kind of see these emerging threats. We have these anti-satellite weapon systems that could potentially destroy or limit satellites, including our directed energy weapons, which can blind our imagery satellites. And even if the energy is strong enough, it could potentially damage lenses on our imagery satellites. So then we have this concept of space debris. Space is becoming a lot more contested and congested, a lot of more pieces flying around space. A lot of smaller objects too that are being launched, and so that's problematic because we can't detect all those. The systems that we have that are able to detect small satellites only can detect up to a certain size. So as these satellites begin getting smaller and smaller, that is a potential challenge to overcome. So then we have our cyber issues. So the Space Systems Command came out and said, like, hacking on orbit satellites, infiltrating those ground system computers. Even there was the ISS at one point was hacked, and someone actually had control of it. And the reason for that was because NASA did not have the proper uh, the proper security, cyber security on their computer system. So someone was able to hack it and actually take control of the ISS. Drones, other computer systems. So you're talking about compromising satellites, which in the United States, China, Russia, right? That is potentially extremely damaging on a military level and on a just a civilian population level. So what is the militarization of space, right? We see this establishment of space forces and policies. So the US Space Force was established, US Space Command was brought back into existence. We have the space capstone that kind of outlines these different guidelines of why space is so important. The national security strategy has now incorporated all these things. And we definitely see a growing competition for space dominance, right? It has expanded way beyond the Soviet Union and the US. China's getting involved, commercial entities are getting involved, private entities are getting involved. And this is all good things as long as it's used for good purposes, education. There are different parts of the world that have access to education and other information that they didn't have before. The problem is that we depend, the United States and some of our allied nations depend on satellites for all kinds of information, for intelligence, for communicating with each other, navigation systems, and they all kind of have an important role, not just with the populace at large, but the military. So we're going to see that military becoming more reliant on space systems. So what does that mean if a space conflict happens? That there's a good chance that things are potentially going to go wrong very, very quickly. And we see this with the Russia-Georgia conflict. Russia was in a conflict. They thought, hey, we're going to use all these different electronic warfare systems. They quickly realized they were not as robust as they thought. And then they created a plan to completely revamp their entire electronic warfare system by 2025. Now, the conflict in Ukraine has impacted their ability to be able to do that. But nevertheless, they learned their lesson and they said, we need to start doing better. Um, and then we see the role of space growing in cybersecurity and electronic warfare, which could potentially suppress the free flow of information. We see countries suppressing the information that comes into their countries and not allowing people to have access to certain information. So this is extremely problematic. So then we kind of look at what are the legal and ethical challenges of all this. So we do have current international treaties and regulations, as Dr. Kelso kind of went over. So I won't go into those too much. But we do have these different regulations. Now, the challenges that we have with this is some of those space-based weapon systems, dual use systems. So systems that you hear, oh, we could potentially use this to remove space debris because it has an arm or it has a net. But that could potentially be used as a dual use system, maybe capturing an adversary satellite or something like that. So you could say, yes, this could potentially clean up debris, but it could also cause significant other issues in space. And then different nations, they have their own space legislation, safety standards, as we see, like China will launch over a populated area, not really too concerned. And then when something goes wrong, they're like, oops. So, each nation's going to have their own way of wanting to do things. And then again, potential trying to mitigate the amount of debris that's being put in space. So there kind of are these geopolitical implications. We're seeing power shifts currently happening, the role of space warfare between the United States and China, right? China has launched so many different satellites at a rapid pace. So this is concerning. That means they're getting more access to information, imagery, being able to communicate all those different things. And then what does this look like for NATO and other alliances that are being formed as this international tension continues to grow? Outer space is it's a great source of revenue and economic growth, but it's also extremely challenging and presents some of these really complicated tensions that are happening from a military standpoint. And we could see that space has influenced strategic level of war for a long time, right? And then it's providing increased information of our nuclear concerns, launch indications, how we track forces. So if something ends up going wrong, how are we potentially going to do those things? Are there, I mean, if you talk to a lot of the younger generation, can they read a map? Um, that is something that is not a thing anymore, right? I mean, even doing certain problems like, oh, why do I have to? I have children, they're like, why do I have to learn math if I have a calculator? Just being able to go and understand these really important concepts of how to do things because everything is so digitized now. So what we're seeing is these space-based assets are shaping the modernization of warfare strategies. They provide significant strategic advantages. They give a sense of that national pride, but it also leads to this increased competition for space dominance. Because our satellites protect, they enable, and they kind of give us this operational advantage. Just like any other system, they do have their vulnerabilities. And if we're relying on them heavily, we're going to have a big weak spot. So one of the things that I really quickly just wanted to touch on was that Russia and China are very well aware of our weakness. The other thing is too, China has kind of focused on this space plan that they have, their space um, strategy, and they want to control information, because if I control the electromagnetic spectrum and I control what goes in and out and who gets what, I then could potentially rule the world. And Russia has even made that same statement. They said, if we can control the flow of information, if we can control that spectrum, we hold the power. And that is absolutely true right now. So some of the recommendations that are still going to be extremely challenging are international cooperation and communication among allied nations. And this is more than just like, hey, space is a threat and we need to look at it more. We really need to look at these threats, how, not just what's happening now, but how are they going to continue to evolve? Instead of dealing with what is happening right now, we need to examine how is this potentially going to grow as space continues to grow. And then kind of focus on some of the legal challenges and frameworks, because we can't control what the commercial sector does with their imagery. If they're taking pictures, they can go ahead and sell that imagery to whatever nation that's going to give them money for it. And then having decisive action on policies concerning space-based systems. And what I mean by this is that a lot of times we like to talk about the problem, but then there's no action that's followed up with it. It just becomes another meeting to say, hey, we're going to continue to explore and look at this problem, and then someday maybe we'll have a solution. And I understand that these are extremely challenging situations, but there has to be decisive action. Because countries, adversarial nations, they're doing things, they're testing their boundaries, they're poking the boundary and saying, okay, well, I got away with that. How much closer can I get to your satellite before you do something? And essentially these satellites are waving to each other in space. So it's very important that we take this threat seriously before that boundary gets crossed and things start really going downhill. And then focusing kind of on the mitigation of threats. My focus really for the recommendation is mitigation of threats. We can have international cooperation all day long, but we really need to understand space's true potential in the event of a conflict, right? If it's exploited, it is going to cause really grave damage, not just to our national security, but the populace at large. Not being able to use phones, bank accounts, a lot of people do online shopping. That's not going to be a thing. Access to resources, very, very problematic. In conclusion, I just have this last quote, for the wise man looks into space and he knows that there's no limited dimensions. So anyone can look into space. It's unstoppable if you want it to be, and you can yield the power for good, or you can yield the power to take the power. And not saying that we should do that, but we definitely have to be cautious of those who want the power to be able to control what is going on around the world. So I'm not sure if I talked super fast because I forgot to look at the time, but I thank you all for coming and listening, and I'll pass it back over to you, Dr. Watts.
Yeah, you were perfect. Thank you. Okay, next up we have Andrea Mosella, and she is a doctoral candidate in the School of Global Security at American Public University and a Fulbright Scholar. Andrea has a BS in Space Studies, an MA in Political Science, an MS in Aeronautics. She works in the science support role at NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, and an adjunct professor at Georgia Military College. And in addition to that, she has recently embarked on her Fulbright scholarship in Romania, where she's on a student grant to research climate change security risks. So her topic today, we're looking forward to from rivalry to alliance. So we'll take it away, Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Watts. I'm going to continue that conversation and looking actually at the relationship in space between the US and China, and if there is any room for cooperation or there's going to be just a space race between the two nations. So the current landscape of the US and China relations as it pertains to space is actually characterized by a very complex interplay of both competition and also cautious engagement where possible. While both nations do pursue ambitious space programs and plan to achieve significant scientific and also strategic milestones, For example, lunar exploration and also Mars missions. The approaches of each of them actually reflect their broader geopolitical tensions between the two and the pursuit of technological supremacy and space exploration supremacy, actually. The United States has a long history of space exploration and also is currently involved in new initiatives such as the Artemis Accords that has been already discussed here today. The US continues to lead actually in innovation at this moment in both space technology and also in international collaboration when it comes to spacefaring. Meanwhile, China has rapidly expanded its capabilities, which have been marked by achievements such as the Chang'e lunar missions and also the establishment of the Tiangong space station, which positioned China as a really serious player in the global space arena. This dynamic sets a backdrop for competitive coexistence between the two, but also opens some possibilities for collaborative opportunities in areas of mutual interest. Navigating the dual aspects of rivalry and potential alliances between the two countries in space is very important for the strategic interest of both nations and also for the international community. While driving technological advancements and national pride, rivalry often leads to duplicative efforts and heightened tensions that could actually escalate conflicts between the two countries and also global conflicts. At the same time, alliances can lead to shared successes and also cost efficiencies and can foster international norms and promote peaceful cooperative use of outer space. As such, it is important to try and find collaborative and cooperation venues if possible. So looking at the history of space exploration that has been shaped by efforts and also achievements of both United States and China, and each followed distinctive trajectories that are influenced by their political, scientific, and also technological interests. The United States obviously embarked early in space in a space journey with NASA's establishment in 1958, and had monumental achievements such as the Apollo moon landing and also the space shuttle. At the same time, China initiated its own crewed space program, but a little bit later than the United States, and founded the China National Space Administration in 1993. Although they started later than the United States, China has achieved a lot of progress in space, specifically the manned Shenzhou missions, the Chang'e lunar exploration program, and also the Tiangong space station. The evolution of the US and China space program are very important in driving the current space activity on the planet. Although they were initially driven by nationalistic goals and Cold War rivalry, the spacefaring has increasingly seen the need of international cooperation, specifically because of the immense costs that space involves, and also technological challenges, and definitely shared interest in scientific discovery. So looking at the strategic implications of the US-China interactions in space, they are really multifaceted and reflect both nations' recognition of space as a critical new domain for national security, but also economy development and definitely technological leadership. As space capabilities become integral to national defense through satellite reconnaissance, communication and navigation systems, as Larissa discussed earlier, Both US and China started to view space as a strategic frontier for asserting their global power and influence. So looking at the technological advancements, the ongoing space race between the US and China has definitely resulted in technological advancements that push boundaries and what is actually possible in space. The United States has continued to innovate in areas like rocketry, with the development of reusable space launch vehicles that SpaceX is providing to NASA at this moment. And at the same time, China has also made notable strides with its Long March rocket series, and they also had breakthroughs in robotic space exploration, as demonstrated by the Chang'e lunar rovers. Despite the tensions between the two nations, an alliance between the US and China in spacefaring would have a potential for developing collaborative technologies that could benefit everyone on the planet. Such joint ventures could focus on specific areas like space habitat development, as both intend to go to the moon and Mars. And the combined expertise in, for example, life support systems and also sustainable space living conditions could really be beneficial to everyone intending to do deep space travel. In terms of looking at competition, I can't think of a better example at this point than the Mars sample return that NASA is leading, and the equivalent of this mission, the Tianwen-3. The comparative dynamics between these two really could lead to innovation and enhance mission capabilities. But at the same time, the race to retrieve these extraterrestrial samples has a very strong influence on global space policy and points to the need of really the development of robust planetary protection measures and frameworks that govern the use of sharing of space derived resources such as samples from Mars. In terms of cooperation, while direct space cooperation between the US and China is really limited at this time because of policy restrictions, there are actually potential avenues for collaborative efforts in areas such as climate science and also asteroid threat mitigation, which is a threat to the entire planet, not just one nation. So having such projects could leverage the unique capabilities of both nations, as, for example, China's advanced satellite technology and the US's extensive experience in climate modeling. In terms of benefits from such a cooperation in space, obviously joint missions could lead to cost-effective space exploration. And what is very interesting, I would say, is reducing duplication of effort and pooling resources for more ambitious projects, probably deep space exploration or constructing an outpost on lunar or Martian surfaces rather than just doing the same missions over and over again in by both countries. So in looking at the possibility of enhancing global cooperation through the Artemis Accords, the Artemis Accords have been already mentioned here today. They do represent a great opportunity for structuring space exploration dynamics between US and China. This could allow an alignment between the two countries and help collaboration rather than competition. If China would consider adopting the Artemis Accords, this would offer a significant strategic benefit for cooperation with the other members of the Artemis Accords. In terms of legal and policy frameworks that has been already discussed today extensively, the Outer Space Treaty of '67 is the foundational framework for spacefaring. And but unfortunately, US-China relations in space are really complicated at this moment, specifically by national laws such as US's Wolf Amendment, which does restrict NASA and the White House Office of Science and Technology policy that restricts from engaging in bilateral agreements and coordination with the Chinese entities. Given the evolving dynamics of space exploration, I would say that there is a clear need for updating the international agreements that reflect current realities. They are old, specifically Outer Space Treaty, and potential areas for new contracts or modification could include norms such as the Artemis Accords that are currently being promoted by the United States. At the same time, cooperation does have economic and security implications. Competitive space exploration does drive rapid technological innovation and also economic growth because nations do strive to outpace each other. But at the same time, security considerations in space exploration are really linked to the broader balance of power between the nations, specifically US and China. And such competitive actions in space can escalate tensions between nations and lead to an aggressive and weaponization of space rather than exploring space for peaceful purposes. In terms of recommendations for policy and engagement, US and China could consider several strategic approaches to foster greater cooperation in their spacefaring activities. An aspect that has been already quite successful were joint scientific research initiatives that have been going on despite the tensions between the two countries. Because such initiatives can really focus on areas of mutual interest and less sensitive technologies that could generate tensions between the two. So that would be all. Thank you for your attention, and I would appreciate any questions.
Okay, terrific. Yeah, and we will go to Dr. James Barney next, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. This is our last panelist. Dr. James Barney is a professor of legal studies in the School of Security and Global Studies. He has several master's degrees and has recently added a PhD to his achievements. And he is also a mentor for several student organizations, including the Model UN Club. So Dr. Barney, over to you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for introducing me. Do you hear me, Michelle? You do? Okay. I always ask that because even though I talk about technology and I'm a big advocate of technology, for some reason I have problems working it myself. But today's a rare pleasure for some of you. You get to see me. I'm always typically camera shy, but today I'm going to stay on camera because I have this presentation. And today I'm going to talk about something that really is very important, and it demonstrates how space studies is really an interdisciplinary field. As the prior panelists spoke about, there's talk about global politics, law, issues about ethics, about issues about militarization of space and conflict. And my topic falls within a very different area, which is about how when we're crafting as academics a academic program, and how we can craft an interdisciplinary program that's inclusive for as many people as possible. And one of the issues that I've been doing a great deal of research in and thinking about is AI and how AI is going to transform education. And it's no longer theoretical, but it's actually happening right now. So AI has had a transformational impact on space exploration. And this is not science fiction any longer. This is actually things that are happening today. AI is being used in exploration of Mars and the moon, and astronomy, and all different fields to crunch numbers, to run experiments. So we're moved from the point of is AI going to be used? No, it's already being used, and now AI is going to have a tremendous impact on all classrooms, not just space studies classrooms, but it's going to be a transformational impact on how teaching and learning is done. It could be used for simulations, for data analysis, to develop personalized learning, to do enhanced research, to do skills development. And you can do contributions to real world, space exploration from your office. You can be playing around and run data sets off of shared information that's being used by public and private entities. So we've moved from is AI going to be used? No, it's being used. It's going to transform the classroom. But as everybody knows, who listens to anything I always say, it's always with me is a mixed. With everything comes benefits and also risks. So one of the real risks in this digitalization and the use of AI is growing.
I'm sorry to interject. We had a request to make your presentation full screen. If you want to hit that little button.
You guys see it now?
Yes. Thank you so much.
Okay. As I said, one of the challenges is the potential growing divide and disparity between people who have access to the internet and people who don't have access to the internet. As anybody knows, during the COVID period, that was put on full display when there's a tremendous amount of people in the developing world, in the rural and minority communities that don't have access to the internet, and the same percentages of those who do. And this is not only in the developed world in the United States, but in the developing world. I use Africa as an example, and Africa is just one. You could pick India or parts of Asia or South America, where the population that has access to the internet is 40% in Africa as compared to 60-something% in the developed world. And that's not, it doesn't seem like a big difference, but you're talking about potentially hundreds of millions of people who don't have access to the internet, and worldwide that maybe billions of people. So what does that digital divide mean for space studies? And space studies is very reliant upon the internet and AI. So that means that a tremendous amount of people are going to be excluded potentially from the field of space studies, and that potentially deprives the field of a great diversity of perspectives and talent. Because there's a potential that it may become just the certain schools, elite universities may be into space studies. But what I believe is, and I always get, well, who am I to say what should happen? And these are only suggestions about what I think should, happen or to remedy this potential problem. And there needs to be more public and private partnerships between governmental and maybe for-profit companies to work together to provide access, and equitable access to both the internet and artificial intelligence tools. And that has to be done to underserved, schools in the developed world and in the developing world. In my view, intergovernmental and supergovernmental agencies, I'm talking about the UN and, different world organizations, they have to be a stronger voice for advocating for equitable access to the internet and AI as human rights. This, in my view, is linked to the right to education, because people have a right to education. One of the rights in the 21st century is you can't have a 21st century education without access to the internet and the access to artificial intelligence, because they're going to so revolutionize the education that there needs to be a more focused, concerted effort. Now, as academics, we have to do whatever we can do to try to spread the call that there needs to be more access to the internet and AI tools. And of course, at the end of the day, what it's going to be is ordinary people are going to, in the community-led initiatives, try to demand access to AI and the internet because there's a tremendous need for these particular tools. And if you don't have the tools, you can't have the entry into space studies. And this, I mean, use space studies as one example because that's what the conference is about, but it's in all academic fields that we don't remedy this digital divide between the haves and the have-nots, not only space studies, but all fields are going to be deprived of really a tremendous amount of human talent. And that's not only going to harm the field of space studies and these other academic fields, but also people's human potential. So, in my opinion, in order for space studies and all academic areas to fully become robust fields, they have to embrace a equitable access to both the internet and AI technology. You know, us space study educators, we have to work with the government and non-governmental actors to ensure that the field reflects the great diversity of the world so that the benefits of space exploration, which are going to be tremendous, it's going to be a multi-trillion-dollar industry, are shared by the greatest number of people across the world. And that's only possible if as many people are at the table representing different voices and negotiating how these benefits are going to be spread to different people. You know, I use the example, the map of Africa, but Africa it needs to also, and parts of Asia and the whole world need to be at the table to represent their particular interests as the tremendous wealth of space exploration and technology are working themselves out. And ultimately, educators, ordinary people, and private companies and governments, they have to work together to promote equitable access to the AI and the internet because it's not just about being fair, but it's important to have for academic to have the most amount of people at the table to make sure the results are the most fair for the world. That's so. It may seem to many people this is all pie in the sky. So, well, but it's really about how we're creating a more just society and how we're creating a society in space that hopefully reflects the best ideals that we can portray, and project. Space shouldn't be, in my view, and we talked about today, militarization and conflict and the laws, but it also should be driven by ethics, and how we're going to create a more just society, not just here, but in space. But as I always end my conversation, now I can go back to, I get off my soapbox and I can go back to grading, but I really appreciate the opportunity to talk at these conferences, and it gives me the ability to harness a lot of different things together and try to hopefully in some small way shape the role of space studies, and it can be a more just, fair, equitable pursuit. Well, thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I was really just thinking about as you were talking how some of these, tie together so closely, even education and warfare. Larissa, you mentioned, the vulnerability of satellites. A lot of those satellites are providing internet, not just to, developing countries, but our own, rural areas in the United States. And I hear, even in indigenous communities, them saying, thanks, to Starcom, I believe it is, we finally got internet. That's what it took. And so if those, were to be taken out, whether on purpose or just as collateral damage, it does leave a good part of the population, kind of in the digital darkness, you might say. I put some questions in the chat for you all to think about in our webinar chat. Sorry, I can't seem to be able to do it in the public chat. But if anyone in the audience has questions, we would really welcome that. I'm just reading Kelsey's comment. Great takeaways for educators. Thank you so much for the presentation. Lots to digest. So if any of you want to, if you can see those questions I posted, or if you have discussion points yourself, we
Dr.
welcome
Watts,
additional questions too.
do you want me to paste those questions in the public chat?
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah. If you
I'll
won't
do it.
mind, if you don't mind.
I can take a stab at the Russia-China, like how do we know their plans? So for China, they have come out with the China Space Dream, and that's kind of their insights into what they're hoping to gain from space. And then they've also shifted a focus to information dominance and information warfare tactics. So that has kind of been open. Now we can't know their true intentions with everything, but we do see lots of, speaking of to Dr. Barney's presentation, China has taken a lot of interest in Africa and building education, different jobs in Africa, but they have also built Confucianist organizations within Africa, changed language signs to Mandarin and things of that nature. So that could potentially be something that's concerning. And then for Russia, they have again released their policies on, or well, not policies, but their plans to change their electronic warfare. We see them trying to catch up when it comes to, they've been in the space industry just as long as the United States, trying to upgrade and update satellites such as their GLONASS system, which is their position navigation and timing system. So definitely we see an expansion. There are some things that are a little bit more transparent as space becomes more transparent in the open source realm. But then we also have to be cognizant because Russia is the king of propaganda and China is kind of following suit with that. So, it's a cautiously optimistic situation that you got to kind of look at it from.
Okay, great. And I see two questions in the chat. One that relates to the China, US-China rivalry. Greetings, thank you. Can you please expand on the importance of being a leader in space exploration as it pertains to the US-China rivalry? I don't know if Andrea, you want to comment on that. And one, just so it doesn't get lost, that we can think about how can AI increase creativity in developing ideas for space studies research? And maybe you could start with that, James, after Andrea has a chance to comment.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Obviously, the rivalry between the US and China in space is not just scientific and technological, but it definitely encompasses broader strategic, economic, and also diplomatic implications. So if you look at the strategic and security implications of being a leader in spacefaring, you can look at national security and defense interest, as dominance in space technology is definitely very important for national security. Also, like anti-satellite ASAT capabilities, as both nations are developing capabilities to neutralize satellites, and they are potentially a form of deterrence. And the control over ASAT technology can be a significant leverage point in international negotiations or conflicts that don't even pertain to space. In terms of economic benefits, also being a leader in space exploration is very important for innovation and technological leadership, but it also leads to new markets and job creation. which is definitely a huge economic benefit. And it also attracts investments from private sector, as we can see here in the United States. And thirdly, I would say in terms of diplomatic and global standing, international collaboration and influence, being a leader in space does translate into geopolitical influence globally, as we have seen already that countries that lead in space exploration have the ability to shape international norms, as we can see with the Artemis Accord.
Thank you.
Michelle, you hear me? With regard to
Yes.
that question on creativity and AI, one of the things as educators we're focused on is, well, AI could be used for plagiarism or it could be used for creating documents, and that's been some of the focus of a lot of the discussion. But people have to realize the great potential creative uses of AI. For example, you have at your power and disposal a system that's been trained in reading, say, thousands and thousands of articles, all the whole body of literature on space studies or whatever field it's been trained on. And if you're developing new ideas for research, you have the access to not only find those articles, but a tool that could digest and say, well, I'm gonna develop a paper on this particular topic. Has anybody said anything about this topic? And it could find in the moment's notice and give you a whole series of articles, and will say, well, I want to be in conversation with this particular article. How would I distinguish myself? So it's a great research tool, but not only that, it's a training tool for students because you can create really complicated role-playing scenarios that are not only that it can change depending upon the student's response, and it's something that students can use to develop their own ideas and also to as almost like a tutorial. So it's a really, people have said, well, AI is really in generating, just generating text, and it's kind of play. No, it's really a much more powerful tool of creative ability, and it's just we're just very, very. Even though AI has been around for a relatively long time, it's come into the popular imagination in the last couple of years. We're just at the very beginning of the potential of what we can use it for as educators and researchers. And, it's promising, but at the same time, it has a lot of risks because some people have access to this. I have maybe access or people at universities, but a lot of people won't have access to the tools that we have. And the key is how do we make it that as many people as possible do have these creative tools at their disposal.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And unless we have other questions from the audience, Mark, I was wondering, do you want to comment a little bit about mitigating threats? My question was, are there ways outside of, regulatory frameworks and treaties to mitigate threats, or even just what you think are the most important steps to be taken?
Thank you, Dr. Watt. Yeah, I mean, Dr. Beavers mentioned it. Launch states want global power and they want to have influence. And there are vast resources out in outer space. And I believe that Andrea mentioned it. Launch states have policies of what they're going to share or not share. And, it's kind of like, it's like we're in a Cold War in space right now. So you want to, if there's some way, and if it's possible, a common ground, and a mutual understanding of the future space exploration of what the launch states are going to do. I mean, right now we know we don't, and as was mentioned today in the presentation, we don't really see it. But, it is the global power influence, and everybody wants those precious, resources from outer space, and that whatever they can, and it's back in 1967, the United Nations come up with the Outer Space Treaty to try to prevent these things from happening, and people are just going to have to try to come together, change their policies, launch states, change their policies. And I think the only way they can do it is kind of a mutual understanding with a common ground, share the same interests, and share the same goals. and stick with the peaceful and beneficial use of outer space.
Yeah, thank you. And I know we just have about 1 more minute, but I think Andrea had mentioned the Wolf Amendment. Is that something, is it counterproductive?
For China, yes.
Does it really kind of, mean that we can't have cooperation?
It makes it difficult to cooperate. I've mentioned at some point in our discussions that we used to have a lot of scientific cooperations with China before, that despite the geopolitical issues have been really thriving. But with the Wolf's Amendment, and it has become increasingly more difficult to even fly under the radar and continue scientific cooperation with both Russia and China.
And I don't know if we have time. We do have a question that's really interesting. What guidelines or regulations are there to develop space technologies that may or may not double up as space weapons?
Well, the main one that really comes up would obviously be Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty with the nuclear weapons of mass destruction. But, like I mentioned in my brief, China and Russia are going to put a nuclear powered moon base. I mean, if you have who knows, how can we regulate that, what they actually do with it? But that's the number one we have right now, so, and 1967 is a great idea, but, a little revision would be in order for that one, if we can actually do that. And again, it would really come to the cooperation aspect.
Okay, thank you.
Just real quick, if I could just touch on that just a tiny bit. So the other thing is that Russia and China have asked the United States to sign like a non-proliferation agreement when it comes to outer space. But again, like knowing what these adversaries are potentially capable of, this is where it gets really challenging, is how can you ask one nation to sign an agreement if you know other nations are doing exactly what they said they're not going to do. So that, we can't say that these assets are weapon systems, right? They can say, oh, it's used for a useful purpose, but it can also be used for a not useful purpose. And I guess maybe we just have to trust that they're not going to use it to capture another satellite. But that's all. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, thanks for the great discussion and the excellent questions and just the audience in general. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks everyone for attending the session, and thank you again to our presenters. And now it's a good time for a short break, as the next session will be in 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you.